Thanks for the introduction, and yes, thanks for those who have rejoined having attended previously. I'm afraid the first few slides you will have heard before, but we will get to some new content that you didn't get to see last time, I hope. So this is a project that I've been working on collaboratively with people from the University of Exeter, UE in Bristol, and SciWem. And we kind of came together in back in May to kind of design this survey. So as everyone is aware, we are living in some really uncertain times. It's quite nice to be able to talk about a topic that everyone is familiar with, and we don't need to give too much of an introduction to it. But in late 2019, there was an acute respiratory disease caused by a novel coronavirus, and it emerged in Wuhan, China. By January, there were 2 cases in the UK, and by March, it had been declared as a pandemic by the World Health Organization and had spread to over 110 countries worldwide. This meant that countries started to implement nationwide lockdowns, and in the UK, this meant that around a quarter of the UK workforce, or 9 million people, became furloughed through the UK job retention scheme. And what this meant was that people were told not to leave their homes for anything other than kind of essential business. And so this would be obviously to buy food or medical supplies, and very little else. You could maybe go out for your 1 piece of exercise a day. So people understandably started to panic. People started to panic buy things and starting to stock up on things that they deemed to be essential. One of those things was toilet paper. And because of that, because people were buying so much of it, and this was something that we did see in the UK, but people in other countries tended to have the same pattern. I remember seeing an article in Australia where people were also stocking up on toilet paper. And for those who are unaware, these alternatives that people tend to switch to can wreak quite a lot of havoc on the downstream infrastructure in the wastewater treatment works, because they are not actually flushable items, they're non-flushables. At the same time, there was the rapid closure of the hospitality industry, and this led to the mass disposal of beverages. So pubs shut and cafes closed, and so people started to literally pour beer and milk down the drain. And this caused kind of changes in wastewater load. It meant that the amount of organic matter that was coming into the treatment works changed, which obviously had implications for the way that they would treat the processes. And ultimately, the research team and I came together and realized this was a threat of an unknown scale. And we wanted to look at how resilient the sector was to such a shock. So today's talk will just kind of cover an overview of the research team who was involved with this project, how we designed the survey and the panel workshop that had preceded that. And then I'm going to break the findings down into 2 parts. So the first part will be looking at employee experiences, and the second part looks at the employees' perceptions of organisation response. And this was essentially how the survey was structured in these 2 parts. And then I'll finish the talk today with an overview of some of the things that we as a research team are looking into now. So just as a quick introduction to the research team, these were the people that were involved in the project and the paper that we have recently just published. And what initially happened was myself and Peter and Alistair came together back in late April and started to have a chat around how this survey might come together. And we decided to design a panel workshop in May. So this was kind of early May. We designed a workshop that would try to capture kind of at a high level the lessons that were relating to the sector's resilience. So between us and with a panel of sector experts, which included around 7 different UK water companies and 3 consultancies, and the people who were involved in this panel were people who were involved at a strategic level with their own company's COVID-19 responses. So we designed the questions to fit around the Safe and Sure resilience framework. So resilience is often used to look at things like climate change, but essentially it can be used to assess any system when that system is subject to threats. So here the threat was COVID-19, but later I'll talk about how there could have been, and in some cases there could be multiple threats occurring simultaneously, and what that might mean for how the sector was able to respond and cope. So we got ethical approval, and we sent out the survey to water sector professionals through the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. And the survey data was collected for around 2 weeks, and we got about 500 responses. So we designed the survey to capture the challenges in a chronological manner and aligning with this resilience framework. So we wanted to find out if there were any impacts and if there were any consequences. So we looked at mitigation measures, and we wanted to understand how prepared the sector was. We also looked at any adaptation mechanisms that had been deployed to respond. And we tried to understand a little bit about how individuals as well as organisations had coped. And then finally, we tried to look around at what lessons had been learned so far so that we could take this through as a way to facilitate knowledge exchange for what is now. We didn't really know at the time how things would pan out, but what is now obviously an ongoing challenge, and we remain in, I suppose, the crisis of the pandemic for the foreseeable future. So I just want to maybe use the chat function if people can access that, just to ask you a question and see what do you think were the biggest challenges the water sector faced during the COVID-19 lockdown. So I'm sure some of the things that you'll come up with will be things that we found in the paper and will hopefully be what I present on. Just what do you think were the biggest challenges the water sector faced during, and I'm talking about the initial kind of national lockdown between May and July. So we've got increased household demand of water, water demand management coming through. Any other challenges? Access by staff to private properties. Yeah. Anybody else want to chip in? Protecting staff, lockdown diversion of usage from non-domestic to domestic, coupled with a drought, quality assurance, security for drinking water contamination. Can COVID be spread in water? Yeah, so essentially, right at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a huge amount of management and learning to go on because there were so many unknowns. It was a new virus that we'd never respond to. We didn't know what the pathways for it were going to be. And that's obviously going to create a lot of challenges. It's also hard to predict impact on non-household consumption. So I'll probably leave that there and come forward through to the next part of the presentation. So as I said, we got around 500 responses, and this was kind of over a 2-week period. We didn't really want to leave the survey out there for too long because we wanted to analyse the data and get the findings out as quickly as we possibly could. So that's only probably about 1% of the people actually working in the sector in the UK, but we did have quite a good split geographically, organisationally, and across job types. So we felt that although it was a reasonably small sample size, it probably still was fairly reflective of the UK sector as a whole. So you can see on this slide a bit of a breakdown between the different categories of how we classified different individual respondents. So we can see that there were 61% of the respondents were male. We can see that the largest proportion of job type was engineers, followed by consultants, and that we can see that the actual organizations that they were working for were spread across quite a few different things. So this just shows the 5 most prevalent organization types, and you can see that that accounted for about 80% of the respondents overall. There were a large proportion of consultants, and that may be a function of the sector or a function of SIOM's membership. But you can also see that there were quite a lot of water service providers completing the survey as well. So a large number of respondents from England. We did get some responses from Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and also not shown on here, there were quite a few respondents of people who alluded to the fact that they either worked nationally or that they worked within the UK, but also did some work abroad. And so they hadn't necessarily specified a particular region, either within England or within the UK. So in terms of employee experiences, as I said at the beginning, the findings are presented in 2 parts, and this aligned with the different parts of the questionnaire. So the first part focused on the employee experiences. So what we can see is that there was a really huge shift. Prior to the lockdown, only about 10% of people worked from home, and about 75% of the people who responded to the questionnaire worked in an office. During the lockdown, this shifted to about 5 to 6% of people working in an office and 84% working from home. So there was a huge shift almost overnight in how people or where people were working. But despite that, around 80% of people felt able to continue their usual pre-lockdown role. And this is perhaps a testament of how quickly the sector was able to adapt their working practices, but it suggests that employees were coping. You can see on the right-hand side that there is a slight difference between the different organisation types, and you can see that contractors were slightly less able to, or felt slightly less able to continue their usual pre-lockdown role compared to the likes of, say, consultants or water service providers. And this may be a function of their job type or their job role. It may be related to how many people they would ordinarily have on site and the nature of the type of work that they conduct. Looking at some kind of other differences based on the survey profiling that we'd done of the respondents, so going back to like who had completed the survey. When we looked at the differences between different groups of people, we could see that fewer women reported an increase in productivity than men. So it was only 1/5 of women compared to 1/4 of men. But more women reported a decrease in well-being. So we've got 39% of women reporting a decrease in well-being compared to 32% of men. But it's quite hard to kind of tease out the individual differences around this because individuals were coping with and adapting to the pandemic in different ways. So some may have had childcare responsibilities, whereas others may have struggled with isolation. On top of that, somebody who may have had a negative consequence, such as isolation, may have also had positive benefits in relation to not having to commute and having extra time in their day because of the amount of time saved from that. So it's quite hard to tease out the overall positive or negative change in their behaviour through productivity and well-being because of those kind of individual complex circumstances that they were each subject to. Looking at a different split of respondents between essential workers and non-essential workers, we saw that essential workers were more likely to report an increase in productivity, and this perhaps highlights the ability of workers to proceed with tasks when everyday obstacles are lessened. So this may be for site workers in particular, whether they are able to get out and repair leaks in the network more easily because there is less traffic on the road. Interestingly, non-essential workers were, or those who didn't know what their status was, were more likely to report a decrease in well-being. And this maybe kind of raises the point that poor communication can really kind of affect well-being, and this can lead to uncertainty in individuals, and this can have quite a profound impact on their well-being. So the second part of the survey focuses on the employees' perceptions of their organisation's response. And the figure here on the right-hand side shows a heat map that was generated from the qualitative analysis. And so you can see along the x-axis that we've got the different questions in the survey. So these were all of the qualitative response, like free text response questions that came up in the survey. And so you can see kind of going through the survey from the beginning to the end. And then we've got the 8 most prevalent themes on the right-hand side. So a darker colour indicates a higher prevalence of mentions in that question. And you can see for some topics, if we look at working from home, for example, that this was highly prevalent in certain parts of the questionnaire, but also became less frequently mentioned as we got towards the end of the questionnaire. And this was because we'd presented that questionnaire in a chronological manner. So initially, when we're looking at kind of question 11 and question 12, that's reflecting on the challenges that they had during the lockdown, things that had been problematic for them, and starting to kind of move through the questionnaire was looking at how they had adapted, how their organisation had responded, but then looking towards the end about challenges for the future. And so there were certain issues, one which is not listed on here, around care responsibilities and childcare, that were particularly heavily mentioned in the earlier parts of the questionnaire, but became less frequently mentioned when looking more to the future. So this slide will now just kind of talk through some of those kind of 8 themes that were on the right-hand side of that figure, and kind of just present some of the main findings that came out from each of those themes. So working from home was the most commonly mentioned theme within the whole questionnaire. It was seen to be the main form of adaptation. It was a large part of the new normal, and yet, despite all of that, it was still a significant challenge to overcome. So at the time that we were asking people to complete this, which was in kind of late May, early June, 58% of people did not think that we would return to normal pre-lockdown working practice anytime soon. And lots of people made suggestions about how this could look moving forward. Communication was largely focused around the information or the guidance that water service providers sought from the regulators, such as Ofwat and the Environment Agency. And essentially, they were hoping for more guidance on compliance and also understanding around regulation, penalties and rewards, particularly around outcome delivery incentives. Finance had 3 key themes. The first was on the impact on individuals. So this included everything from job losses, people who had to let employees go, as well as people who had lost their own jobs. And there were some references to ability to pay bills. On top of that, there was an indication that there was a potential cost burden on water service providers. And this was a function of both the change in wastewater load from the disposal of milk and beer, as well as a decreased revenue from the change in water demand. So obviously, with a shift from primarily metered commercial buildings to domestic homes, which are a mix of metered and unmetered properties. Finally, there was quite a few comments around the impact on future investment priorities and how they may be affected by the outbreak. Health and safety, as you would expect, understandably focused on things like PPE, masks, enhanced risk assessments, and the use of hand sanitizer, as well as social distancing. IT issues was particularly prevalent early on in the questionnaire. So similarly to as we saw with the working from home, it was mentioned a lot at the start, and it was seen to be a challenge in the fact that people had rapidly overnight had to shift to to working online, and this meant that they didn't necessarily have the capacity. There were, references to the bandwidth and the capacity of the network to cope with that, but there was also issues with having the appropriate infrastructure, whether that was the hardware and the software that they needed to complete the work, whether they had the access to the corporate networks, and also things that linked into well-being relating to video call fatigue and the challenges of being able to collaborate through a digital platform. Well-being, as I mentioned, had both positives and negatives. So some people talked about the positives from the outbreak and how their organisation had excelled in this area. But a lot of people talked about the impact of the closure of schools in this kind of early stage of the national lockdown and the implication that that had on childcare. So you can see that women were more likely, at 81%, to refer to the challenge of care responsibilities than men throughout the questionnaire. So site work primarily focused on logistical constraints. And again, this was something that was challenging early on in the lockdown when there were severe restrictions on travel. People weren't able to travel outside of their region or stay overnight anywhere. And there were also links to the altered water demand patterns here, as well as sewer blockages from unflushables and the changes in the wastewater load. And finally, quite a few participants referenced the opportunity to embrace the circular economy when the economy was already being disrupted, and a disruption of this scale really enabled people to commit to a much greener recovery. So each of the themes that we looked at through the paper were considered in resilience framework of mitigation, adaptation, coping and learning. And the main findings from the mitigation measures that had been in place, a lot of the employees in the questionnaire perceived that there were adequate plans in place to prepare for a crisis. And some people attributed this to the preparations that would already be ongoing for Brexit. So whilst the majority of people did think that these plans for the present time were sufficient, some people did ask what impact multiple threats or a threat of an extended duration may have had. And our analysis into this, further analysis into this, is starting to suggest whether the model was actually risk-based or if it was resilience-based. So in terms of adaptation, understandably, some of the key forms of adaptation were working from home and social distancing, as well as the increased use of PPE, of hand sanitizer and masks. I suppose the main finding was that people quickly and successfully adapted to a new way of working, evidenced by the fact that 84% were working from home and 80% of people felt able to continue their usual role. But the challenges were present throughout the whole of the survey, and they were flagged frequently. Some of these related to things like the fact that site work was quite impracticable, but there were also kind of social challenges around increased isolation or a lack of mentoring, particularly for new staff when you're looking at that prolonged work from home period. And obviously there were a lot of challenges still relating to IT infrastructure. Many of these were addressed early on, but there still are challenges within this area to address kind of longer term. So coping was experienced at an individual and at a sector level. From an individual level, IT issues, childcare and isolation made it harder for individuals to cope. But things like good signposting of support and clear, unambiguous communication throughout the organisation helped to address some of these challenges and made it easier for organisations to cope. The fact that 80% were able to continue their roles suggests that the coping mechanisms for individuals were reasonably effective. At the sector level, coping involved the ability to meet an increased potable water demand and to prevent the widespread sewer blockages. But it's something that we need to investigate further about how they managed to achieve this and whether they would be able to cope if there are prolonged incidents or if there are multiple incidents that occur simultaneously. There's lots of learning already, and we're only part of the way through the pandemic, so I'm sure there's still a lot of learning to come. But the crisis highlighted the importance of robust IT systems and good communications. It also suggested that working from home can be effective and that there are environmental benefits of this in relation to less travel and reduced emissions from a lack of commuting. There's still obviously a lot of learning and awareness to be done around the health and safety implications of COVID. That's not something that we particularly focused on, but there were also kind of a lot of challenges as well from that social point of view in terms of overcoming the challenges of isolation and also creating new approaches for collaborative and practical working when staff are working remote from one another. So just like to touch on future research before I open up for a bit more discussion. But before I go into that, I just want to see your opinions again on how you think COVID-19 will continue to affect the water sector now into the medium and long term. So if you can use the chat function again for this. So I'm not thinking kind of really long term, but just, you know, obviously this study was focusing on those first couple of months of the national lockdown. What are the challenges that we might start to face in 6 months' time or through the winter, you know, if we end up going into another local or national lockdown? What challenges may occur that are specific to the water sector? So we've got comments around mistrust and productivity. And anyone think of any technical challenges that may occur or any prolonged issues with some of the things that may have only been a minor issue earlier in the year, but may continue to spiral? Nope. Okay. So I'll just quickly cover a few different of the research themes that we're looking at. So Elizabeth, who I think is on the call, has conducted some semi-structured interviews with a variety of different water companies. So she's been looking at a strategic level, trying to find out exactly what water service providers did to mitigate the threat of a pandemic, and what planning they carried out to assess the vulnerability of water systems to such threats, and whether they experienced any other large-scale threats beyond the COVID pandemic during that time that may have made it harder for them to respond and harder for them to cope. So that research we're currently at the minute just kind of working through. Elizabeth has just about finished coding them, so we'll hopefully be writing that up as a paper shortly. Another area that we're quite interested in exploring further is around the demand patterns. So there has been some research in this already. So looking at how water consumption changed during the COVID-19 lockdown. So the figure on the left-hand side is from Water UK, and they found that during May, some areas the water demand was around 40% higher than usual, and this was mainly due to watering gardens. They also found that peak times for using water were different to what they would normally be, and this kind of coincided with what we found in our study. You know, people reported that the weekday morning peak was later than it would normally be, and they also reported that typically weekday water use was looking very similar to what weekend water use would normally look like. And this is something that Artesia looked into in a little bit more detail. So on the right-hand side here, you can see they've plotted the time of day and the flow per hour. And so you can see obviously that the dark period at the bottom is obviously during the night, where water would not be getting used very much. And so we've got this kind of typical pattern over a period of months, and then the period where it changes is the beginning of the national lockdown. And suddenly the water use is much higher through the day, instead of having these kind of peak periods of water use in the morning and in the evening when people are getting up and when they're coming home from work. So this is looking at domestic water use. And they obviously found the opposite trend when they were looking at commercial buildings, and that's what this figure here shows here. So one of the things that we'd be quite interested to look at is how this continues going forward. So I've put this figure here on the left-hand side, which shows how transport use changed, and this is from some government data, showing how transport use changed when the lockdown was implemented and where we've got back to now in terms of things starting to recover. And a lot of what we were talking about in the initial paper was how we would recover and what the new normal would be. Not necessarily anticipating or predicting or trying to guess what would happen if there was a secondary lockdown or if there were local lockdowns. So what I'm quite interested in looking at now is what might continue to happen for water use. Obviously, this is for transport, but kind of continuing that Artesia study, maybe through collaboration or through working with individual water companies, is starting to look at what impact local lockdowns have on that use, and whether we recover to a new normal, which is different from where we were in January and February. It's not where we were in March and April, but it's somewhere kind of in a halfway house. And somebody sent me a message yesterday from the Institute of Water conference saying that they'd done a quick poll there. And in that conference, they'd asked people about where they were working, how many days a week they spent working from home. And it had gone from this kind of shift from very few people working from home to, in the lockdown, lots of people working from home, to now it being this sort of hybrid model where people are spending a bit of time in both places. So it'll be interesting to see how that affects water use and whether these patterns are likely to remain changed indefinitely, and what that means for operational resilience and security of supply. Finally, one of my other co-authors on the paper conducted a similar survey with the International Water Association, and they were looking specifically at intermittent water supply globally rather than having this UK focus, and trying to identify similarities and differences in the response between developing and developed countries in order to facilitate knowledge transfer. I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors on the paper, and finally, I'd just like to point to an opportunity for research funding. As Andy mentioned at the beginning, I am in Ireland, and so our national funding agency is Science Foundation Ireland, and there is an open rolling call with the EPSRC, which jointly funds research projects for up to 5-year duration. So if there are opportunities to collaborate around similar research areas, this research talk is not my usual research area. I do a lot around wastewater treatment and resource recovery,